Perhaps I could say something about our bigger brother, the national organization, while we're waiting. On Thursday, the 13th, the full Historical Association holds an AGM, and I'll be attending. It's on Zoom, of course. A lot is happening on Zoom, we're pleased to say. They have a full conference, not in Bristol as planned, but on Zoom from Monday the 24th to Saturday the 29th of May. And they'll have lots of speakers, and perhaps like last year, even a pub quiz in one of the evenings. Good fun, that, even if the questions are impossible. If you get lucky and end up in a good team, as I did last year, you might even win. We've got a book token, £10.
Oh.
Are you passing the book around between you?
I can. No, we each get £10. I can bore you with the book I got. There's the book I got with it. Barthes, B-A-R-T-H-E-S, his book on mythologies.
Oh, right.
Newman. I thought Levy's on his own.
It's an old book, but
Where is he?
I haven't read it. It's about semantics, of which I know not very much. I've read the book and I don't know much more.
We're not on video, so you can't see us.
Oh, what is this?
That's the lady I used to play bridge with.
Yeah.
Hello, Robin and Faith.
Hello.
Yeah.
So I can be seen, can I?
Yes. Rowena.
Yes. So,
I
We're
hi.
watching you.
Ah. Good.
Just that light behind me.
Well, I could put this other light in here.
It's still the light behind me.
Yes. There you are. Good.
And what?
Good. Yeah.
That one.
But it's just, no, not yet. No, I'll get it off anyway. Later. If you want. Have to join then by then because it will be in well, it won't be. On Zoom, will it?
So anyway, so the first thing we need to do, we're going to move these all, whichever one you choose, will move into this
How do you mean?
right hand side current book
Scotch
items.
one.
And this is the screen will show you
No,
what you've got in your book, what you've created.
He opened up, let me in 5 minutes before it started, and it put
So
me
the
on to
first
one
thing,
you're already in.
if you're going to start a book, you need a title page, something on the very front to show.
And someone mute who's ever talking, please.
So if we double click on title page.
Who's doing that? Is it starting? No. I'm trying to find it. It's not ready for somebody talking.
Oh,
That's what it is.
Good. Maria Teresa.
Hello. Hello, Andy.
Hello, David.
You got through. You got the program up. I'll have to write them down for the rest of the year.
I'll put them on our blog.
Yeah. Association. Reaching the third, that'd be good. Oh no, debate AGM.
If you click on browse,
Hi, Liz.
Hi, hi.
The program you see on your screen,
Yeah.
we shall put on our blog, which is at essexbranchha.blogspot.com. The tricky
All
bit
right.
is getting Essex Branch HA, all lowercase. So branch has HA right after it, then .blogspot.com. Shame to say that Essex Branch is on Blogger, and you know who shouldn't be mentioned in North America, has revealed his new platform, ex-President Trump, on Blogger too.
Yeah.
So all the worst people, not all the best people are on Blogger.
Perhaps you're listening to us on April the 2nd next year.
Yeah, we've got a good one there, haven't we?
There's nothing here apart from he's talking about I can't get onto it, but that's I'll put onto it. But it's just up here. And there's various people talking.
Yeah, some good speakers, Martin. Well done.
Just one slight problem.
Trying to get onto something else. So I just went on, you know. Yeah.
There's a gallery and things.
Nice picture in the background too.
It's about past, so I'll mute everybody in a second, and then Ian can introduce. I think that Shirley has something to say.
Yeah, I've just lost my, some Zoom things come up and I've lost the main screen. I don't know why.
We got the speaker will answer questions afterwards, and so please, if you have any questions, could you type them into chat, and I'll go through them in sequence that people have entered them. Because there's over 50 people here, to help the Zoom, the amount of data that's transmitted, if people could please switch off their cameras, as obviously still be able to see us, but it means there's a lot less data has to be transmitted. Thank you. Right, I'll mute everybody, and then Shirley can say something.
Mute us all anyway. I switched the video on.
Okay. You need to unmute yourself, Shirley.
I've got it now. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I've just got a little notice because this is a talk about children. There's a talk coming up in June, on Thursday, the 17th of June, at 7 o'clock for a 7:15 start, an electronic talk called Havens East, the Lost History of Basque Child Refugees in 1930s East Anglia. by Dr. Jeanette Baxter from Anglia Ruskin University and Dr. Ed Packard of the University of Suffolk. And they'll tell the little known story of the child refugees who came to East Anglia during the Spanish Civil War. This talk is put on by Chelmsford Amnesty Group. And to book your place, it's free, but you do need to book to get the link. You have to email Chelmsford Amnesty Events, all one word lowercase, @gmail.com. Okay, that's Chelmsford Amnesty Events, all one word lowercase, @gmail.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Essex branch of the Historical Association. Here we are at the end of our round of talks. You probably know that the HA, follows schools in its round of programs beginning in September and trailing off in the summer. Though trailing off isn't the word, we do finish about now. It's of course time for reflection, really. We are surprised, astonished even, delighted that you're out there joining us. Looking at this strange and difficult time, we didn't know if we would have a presence, and we have more than a presence. We have been accumulating your good selves, thank you very much. You've joined us steadily throughout the year, and this has astonished and pleased us. Also, it's something to pause for thought about. We wonder about some of those members who could only join us physically, and we wonder when we shall see them again in our usual meeting place in Chelmsford. It is time for thought, and part of me says, probably like you, I'm lucky, I'm following the WHO guidelines, I'm isolating marvelously. Part of me would think that this is heroic, as the WHO puts it, but a little bit suggests that maybe I'm just following my usual pattern of being lazy and seeking good cheer, and I'm reading a lot, watching TV, and perhaps getting out and about a bit. I'm exercising with Joe Wicks, not so as you'd notice every day, and I am joining HA meetings for my intellectual stimulation. But enough reflection. Let us turn to the main event today, which is to welcome our speaker, Dr. Vivien Newman, who I'm pleased to say is an expert on women's experiences in the First World War. And she will talk to us. She's an author too. She works at the moment at Essex University, but she's written books. I can remember a couple of the titles. Through Shot and Shell, a nurse's experience in the First World War. And another is, of course, Children in the First World War. Her books are available from the publisher Pen and Sword, and they're available on Amazon. But we're very pleased to welcome you, Dr. Newman, and your talk today, as I repeat, Children in the Great War, 1914 to 1918.
Thank you very much indeed for that. And it's lovely to be with you. And I am about to share my screen. So let's hope my technological skills have worked. It seems that they have done. Hopefully everybody has got a slide in front of them. Children at war, what was done to us was wrong. All historians of childhood agree that there is a fundamental dilemma. Childhood is not really fixed. When does it end? My 3-year-old granddaughter thinks that her childhood has ended already and that she's a big person now. Others of us, perhaps myself included, would like to feel that we are still young at heart. So there's a great dilemma with where does childhood actually end? Before 1918, the official school leaving age, which was frequently more disrespected than respected, particularly amongst the working classes who needed their children to go out and start earning money, the official school leaving age was around 13, and some children were taken out of school long before this. Yet school leavers who entered employment in factories, farms, and as domestic servants did not earn an adult wage and were considered juveniles. But if 13 was far too young to end a history of childhood, 21, the age at which a young person was no longer a minor, was far too old for a book about children. So I finally decided to include youngsters aged under 18, the official age at which a man could enlist in the British Army and a woman work in the danger sheds of the munitions factories, or even, and I find this very disturbing, a young person could be found guilty of murder and face the gallows. So 18 was considered a point at which a young person was in transition, if you like, between child and adult. But by deciding to settle for 18, this excluded my young woman who was, or she was just over 18. She had been married for 10 days and became a French war widow. And she was prohibited from returning to school in Lyon. And instead she was offered a place at a boys' school. Much as I would have liked to write about her, I felt that she fell on the wrong side of the age divide. But settling for 18 actually enabled me to include a young man from Newfoundland, Tommy Ricketts, who was the youngest living VC in George V's army. So the age group that I'm going to be talking to you about today is the ages from 0 to 17. And so without further ado, let us find out what it was like to be young in World War I. Hopefully my slide is going to move forwards. Right, I have a slight technical problem. I will stop the share and start again. Sorry about that. There we are. Sorry, we usually have technical hiccups along the way when I'm in charge of the computer. In his foreword to Nina MacDonald's jingoistic wartime nursery rhymes, a reviewer, George Sims, rightly noted, "The tragic note of war has been brought into the nurseries and playrooms of the rising generation." A very cursory glance through this book, through toy sellers, toy manufacturers, and children's book catalogues demonstrates the truth of this remark. By 1914, toys had become big business. All but the very poorest children would have owned a few, including a board game such as Snakes and Ladders. Girls may have owned a rag doll, its china face often made in Germany, whilst most boys and a number of girls had some painted tin soldiers, which proved a very popular wartime gift for English children. A young boy, Henry Harris, who in fact as an adult became an acknowledged expert on tin soldiers, received his first box when his father returned from France in 1916. 2 years later, the now tin soldier-obsessed young Henry owned over 400 figures, subsequently losing almost all of them in a war game in 1918, which proves that gambling never pays. German children were equally enthusiastic collectors. A young German girl from Schneidermühl, deep in the eastern area of Germany, named Piete Kuhr, who you will get to know well during this talk, had an impressive collection. However, her soldiers suffered a more dramatic fate than young Henry's. In March 1915, school children were instructed to bring in tin, lead, zinc, brass, and old iron for the German war effort. Pete writes, "Out of this are to be made gun barrels, cannons, cartridge cases, and so forth. There is keen competition between the classes. So, with heavy heart, my little army, with which my brother and I had so often played, had to meet their deaths. To avoid all the soldiers being sacrificed, I drew lots for candidates for death. I placed the unlucky ones, 2 by 2, in a large metal spoon and held it over the gas flame. The heroes, in their lovely blue uniforms, melted to death for the fatherland." While Pete's sacrificing of her soldiers arguably served some purpose, British children were also being encouraged to sacrifice their toys. Germany was the pre-war mecca of the toy industry. Now, some British children discovered that their favourite toy was an enemy. Elizabeth Owen remembered into old age how, the day war was declared, "I was 7 and I was playing in the garden when I was asked to go in and speak to my grandmother. To Elizabeth's distress, her favourite toy, a German-made camel, was confiscated. Young Ivy Keane, seemingly more patriotic than Elizabeth, rejected her lovely china-faced doll when learning from her brother of its German origins. Ivy promptly divested it of all its clothes and hung it upside down in the gooseberry bush, where it languished for many a month. Miniature soldiers appeared in wartime picture books destined for the youngest children. Charlotte Moulet's L'histoire d'un brave petit soldat, the story of a brave little soldier, opens in a toy cupboard. Immediately war is declared, the nameless brave little soldier, thereby of course representing all brave French soldiers, rushes to enlist, cheered on by all the other toys, depicting allied nations, but not of course Central Power ones. He heroically defends France, shoots down planes, holds back the enemy, is decorated for bravery, imprisoned, cunningly escapes, is seriously wounded, is miraculously brought back to life by 6 Red Cross nurse dolls, a suitably gendered wartime girl's gift, and is conveniently become fit enough to join in the toy cupboard victory celebrations, even though, when the book was published, the war had another 3 years to run. So this little soldier did it all at breakneck speed. Bellicose picture books with fictional children demonstrating patriotic behaviour were not restricted to France, and in fact they were found across all combatant nations. Tapping into a well-established pre-war tradition, many ABC books were available for the very young. The brightly illustrated 1914 The Children's ABC of the War, dedicated to little Robin, not yet 4 years old, reminded pre-war readers that that's for England, true to her trust, peaceful yet ready to fight when she must. Not wishing to be outdone, the senior service, the Royal Navy, and ABC for Little Britons, reminded readers that B is for Britannia, the land of the free, and thanks to our battleships, Queen of the Sea. Although the child dressed in sailor uniform on the last page is only 7, he intends to sail on the Iron Duke with Jellicoe, where I'll do my best to fire the guns and sink the warships of the Huns. Whether fought by toy soldiers or 7-year-olds, the war was graphically present on pre-readers' bookshelves and in their toy cupboards. German-speaking children were equally well catered for. Taking its name from the popular soldiers' song Lieb Vaterland magst ruhig sein, Dear Fatherland, Don't Worry, a small band of German and Austrian boys play peacefully in their garden until Serbia, his big brother Russia, aided by dastardly French, Belgian, English and Japanese boys, cruelly attack them. Battle is joined, but the little gardeners are victorious. Having imprisoned their enemies, they peacefully continue gardening. However fictionalized its portrayal, children who were too young to read for themselves could still be reminded of a war in which many of their fathers and older kin were fighting, and which they were told was being fought to make the world safe for them. Or, in the words of one of Nina MacDonald's wartime nursery rhymes, hush my baby crying, daddy's gone a-flying, to stop the flight of Zeps at night, while you are safely sleeping, your daddy's keeping vigil in the sky. The mention, of course, that German children's daddies might be flying in Zeps was not made at all. War toys also abounded. Parents wanting to keep their sons fit for the army invested in the popular Punch the Kaiser dummy, which claimed it would keep boys strong and muscular. Meanwhile, during Christmas 1914, British families could sink German submarines whilst playing Kill Kyle, the new naval war game with submarine mines. The most adventurous could find their way to Constantinople, while others could dash to Berlin. Priced at 1 shilling trade, which is around £5.50 today, this new and breathless game for winter evenings promised all the excitement with, reassuringly, none of the danger. Players representing Great Britain, France, Belgium and Russia rolled the dice to move along the grid, the winner being the first one to reach square 90, which was Berlin. In recruiting for Kitchener's army, players rose from private to field marshal, depending on the number of recruits they enlisted. Traditional snakes and ladders, or the French equivalent of jeu de loi, lent itself easily to Central Power's snakes, baddies, and allied ladders goodies. Games such as Peace with Honour, with its goal of reaching a sensible détente, and conscientious objector dolls were rare exceptions in the jingoistic theme. Not all of the games were board ones. 1915's most gruesome offer was the Exploding Trench, a 30-centimetre long wood and cardboard muddy green coloured trench contained half a dozen miniature soldiers. When the Union flag was struck, the soldiers were catapulted into the air in all directions as if by an explosion. Despite the box claiming that it was very interesting with no danger, it was deemed to have crossed the thin line dividing acceptable and non-acceptable toys, and its life was short-lived. So much so that a rare example was snapped up at auction in the United States for $7,200 in 2013. Perhaps bit parts of soldiers flying around the room was too graphic a reminder of the fate that might be awaiting young players' male kin. If the Exploding Trench was deemed to be too close to reality, by 1916, Viennese children were experiencing what one might almost consider an early theme park. Parties of school children visited the Schützengrabe, or trench, in the amusement park in Vienna, where mock-up trenches covered the equivalent of approximately 22 football pitches. Further realism was provided by the landscape, with shattered farmsteads, abandoned positions, and barbed wire, behind which the enemy lurked, whilst a colossal painting helped create the illusion of being in the line of fire. A naval battle was also reconstructed nearby. From the outset, children revelled at playing war. In August 1914, 6-year-old Simone de Beauvoir invented what she later termed games appropriate to the circumstances. As yet showing no sign of her ardent feminism, I was Poincaré, my girl cousin George V, my sister Hélène was the Tsar. We held conferences and we set about the Prussians. In Germany, in December 1914, 12-year-old Piete and her friends refused to be beaten by the weather. Despite it being so cold we can hardly play soldiers in the yard, the ever-pragmatic Piete arranged to have a drill session to harden us up. After all, our troops at the front suffer much greater cold. In Turkey, playing war games was even state-sanctioned. With the official aim of raising orphan boys in the most profitable way possible, both intellectually and physically, 300 rifles were sent to an Istanbul orphanage. These proved so successful in instilling order and nationalist feeling that the War Ministry dispatched a further 1,000 across Turkey. Enemy flags, uniforms, and military equipment captured at Gallipoli further enhanced orphan boys' nationalistic pride. The boys, many of whom were in fact soldiers' orphans, were instructed to play war using these genuine items, thereby instilling nationalistic and militaristic feelings with reference to both their father's martyrdom and their fatherland's victory. These young Turkish boys were not alone in using genuine props, and those brought home by serving relatives were deeply prized. English children loved the German Pickelhaube, or helmet, whilst Piete Kuhr's uncle Bruno believed that his October 1916 gift of his old army boots and an enemy soldier's steel helmet would enhance her war games and her frequently low status among her school friends. The reality proved very different. She writes, "When I looked more closely inside the helmet, I saw that on the edge of the neck there was a name scratched with a sharp object. I began to think, this man is no longer alive. I am holding his helmet in my hand. Me, a German girl, one of those who killed him." Deeply disturbed by this bringing of the war into the home, by January 1917, the helmet and Uncle Bruno's army boots have become increasingly significant to this deeply sensitive German adolescent. She wondered, why has fortune sent me the soldier's helmet and Uncle Bruno's army boots? There must be some meaning in it. I have actually told Uncle Bruno that one day I would invent a dance that portrays a soldier rising from a mass grave. On the 8th of November 1918, Piete's now serving brother arrived home in his torn army uniform. She suddenly knew this would complete the dance costume: steel helmet, army boots, battle dress. I had to have it all before he surrendered it to some idiotic quartermaster. Having fought bitterly and won, I held the uniform pressed against me with both arms, sobbing bitterly. The poor, poor German field uniform. With her war games relegated to her former existence, 16-year-old Piete, now a committed pacifist, choreographed her dance, Spectre of War. Subsequently performed on the professional stage, this dance would eventually lead her to staring death in the face and fleeing Nazi Germany with only the clothes she stood up in. Although children played war games and pretended to be soldiers, for many children, the soldiers of whom they saw most were POWs or prisoners of war, and these feature in several of the diaries that I used extensively in my research for this book. Some children, who initially saw POWs as bogeymen, came to accept them as part of the wartime landscape, with friendships growing up between children who were missing their fathers and soldiers who were missing their own youngsters. Young Henri Dillot felt that the POWs who worked in his village, including for his carpenter grandfather, were to be pitied. He made a point of always greeting them politely. Bonjour, Boche. Some made him toys out of spare bits of wood, which, when instructed to throw them away, he simply hid and retrieved at night. Such intimate contact made him, and many like him, find it hard to believe the stories that Allied children were constantly being told of Germans cutting off children's hands. French teenager Marcelle Lerouge also began to understand that German soldiers were, like French ones, human beings. Shown a cache of letters removed from dead Germans, which were scrutinized for possible military intelligence, there are hints that she realizes that much of the negative propaganda fed to the French public about their enemies was simply that. Although children living in France and Belgium's occupied zones would have disagreed, Marcelle believed that the soldiers display no enmity towards us and do not speak of victory but of peace, which they await eagerly. One soldier's seemingly mundane letter particularly distressed her. His poor mother will never know that he died when suffering from a heavy head cold. She sees the ironies of letters destined for loved ones in Germany remaining in France and wonders if the reverse happens to letters from dead or captured French soldiers. In October 1914, Piete in East Germany discovered a camp and a cemetery holding predominantly Russian POWs on the outskirts of Schneidermühl. She and her best friend Gretel visit the little Russian cemetery to rake it and clear it of weeds. Having completed their task, Piete prayed, "Dear God, take these dead enemies into your care for ever and ever. Amen." On numerous occasions, sometimes accompanied by Gretel, sometimes alone, Piete visited both the camp and the cemetery. On the 19th of March 1917, now, like the majority of German children suffering from severe malnutrition, she muses, "Just what do the 45,000 prisoners in the Russian camps eat? That's what I'd like to know. Gretel and I still go past the camp and put a few eatables through the fence when the guards are looking the other way. But I actually think they look the other way on purpose." Whilst these children empathized with enemy prisoners, in brutally occupied Sedan, two children who, along with Piete, were amongst my most valuable primary sources, record living with the enemy. Yves Congar and Germaine Paruit Both record in the diaries they kept throughout the war a deeply distressing episode which occurred on the 2nd of January 1917, the arrival of Romanian prisoners of war in Sedan. Yves, with a maturity beyond his then 13 years, comments how, today, these living corpses that were once proud soldiers arrived at Sedan. In images that still have the power to shock, both young diarists graphically describe the starving, bleeding Romanians stumbling under the blows their captors rained down on them. As the horrified Sedanais watched this parade of pitiful humanity, they endeavored to give what little food they had, which led to a stampede, prisoners turning on each other for a crumb of bread. Germaine notes the animal-like sounds emitting from the prisoners' throats. She understands how the incident has shaken the Sedanais, whose husbands, sons, loved ones are themselves held as prisoners of war in Germany. Might they be being treated in similar fashion? Both children are proud of their local townsmen who tried to share what little food they had with the prisoners. We will be hungry tonight, wrote Germaine, whilst Yves detailed the fines imposed on those who were caught throwing food, not to mention the baker, who in act of both courage and defiance, the next day refused to sell any bread to the Germans, saying her bread was reserved for Romanians and French. Sedan was fined 50,000 marks for its humanitarian actions, leading to increased suffering amongst its already suffering population, which both children describe in detail. By October 1918, Belgians were also close to starving, and, as in Sedan, a number of children were kept alive by feeding programs, which included giving them a brioche for their lunch. Little Yvonne Vieslet and Monceau-sur-Sambre was amongst the beneficiaries. On the 12th of October, she and her school friends heard that a group of French prisoners of war would be briefly held in Monceau, surrounded by armed guards. Distraught at the prisoners' pitiful state, and heedless of the commands barked out by the German guards that all contact with prisoners was verboten, Yvonne rushed forward and handed her precious bun to a prisoner. To the horror of bystanders and prisoners, a shot rang out, and 8-year-old Yvonne crumpled at her mother's feet. She died 24 hours later, her humanitarian actions leading to her posthumously becoming the youngest recipient of the Médaille de la Reconnaissance Française, the Croix de Guerre avec Palme, and the Cross of the Order of Leopold. Her memorial, desecrated by the Nazis in 1941, was reinstated post-World War II. Sadly, the street named after her in Charleroi has recently been renamed in honour of a boxer. Children were not only observers of prisoners of war. Elisabeth Schucker, born in 1904, lived with her younger sister and widowed schoolmaster father in Popoen, in Germany, close to the Russian border. On the 28th of August 1914, Elisabeth writes how a cyclist shouted the words that the town had long dreaded: "The Russians are coming." We tore across the fields trying to hide. While we were doing this, the Russians surrounded the cyclist who had given the warning and started beating him up. We will never forget that sight. The entire district was soon put to the flame, and it burnt day and night. On the 14th of September 1914, along with many others, Elisabeth's family were arrested. Armed soldiers escorted us to the station. Spending 20 days in a cattle truck heading to an unknown destination, the journey acquired a nightmare quality. Food was almost non-existent, but lice, the soldiers' constant companion, soon proliferated, and on the rare occasions water for washing was provided, had to be used by 4 or 5 people. As the train ploughed ever further east, she notes how the word "where" was going round and round in everyone's head. With the guards having stolen most of their possessions, the deportees arrived in Krasnoyarsk in Siberia. Perched on a barren plateau surrounded by barbed wire, the largest internment camp in Russia, became Elisabeth's new home. With disease soon sweeping through the camp, Elizabeth lists both fatalities and explained how internees found ways of adapting to life behind the barbed wire, where it quite simply shrinks to hunger, want, and death. Exacerbated by extreme cold, temperatures of below -45 degrees, the families who were held as prisoners' lack of defined status constantly impacted upon them. Were they prisoners of war, which at least gave them military rank, or were they civilians with whom nobody knew what to do? Frequently lodged in the prison camp where we get rations, but at times forced to seek accommodation outside where we lose rations, the impoverished detainees have to fend for themselves. Encouraged by her schoolmaster father, Elizabeth kept a diary throughout her captivity, and this records what can be seen as her gradual return to life. Rather than any palpable Russophobia, she became intrigued by her surroundings, struck by how the Russians, with their fair hair and blue eyes, these Siberians are far from the barbarians of German discourse. We have had the opportunity to enter into closer relations with them and get to know them as people, and we get to understand their customs. In May 1918, Elizabeth's family was liberated under the terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Initially traumatized, this child prisoner of war had come to identify with the enemy amongst whom she had lived for over 3 years. During their 2-year return journey across a Russia in turmoil, undertaken mainly in carts and troikas, she was touched by Russian generosity. If we are not frozen, we owe it to the pitiful Russian women who gave us furs and felt boots. Far from the war, from the front, these people know nothing of the hatred of war. Similarly, an elderly Russian peasant who watched in bewilderment as the German families were repatriated commented, "Why, the Germanskys are just like us." One could argue that Elizabeth, with her home so close to the Russian frontier, had the misfortune to live in the wrong place at the wrong time. A group of children who lived in the wrong country at the wrong time were of Ukrainian heritage. Let me explain. In the late 19th century, the Canadian government sought immigrants to populate its vast territories in the West. Many of those 1.5 million individuals of multiple religious faiths and ethnic backgrounds were enticed by the Canadian government's promise of 160 acres of free land, came from Germany and the ramshackle Austro-Hungarian Empire, including the Ukraine. The Ukraine was not then an independent country. 80% of it was ruled by Russia, and the remaining 20% lay in the Austro-Hungarian provinces of Galicia, Bukovina, and Transcarpathia. Driven partly by loathing of their Austro-Hungarian overlords, these immigrants put down roots in Canada, raised families, and some even managed to buy their own houses. Canada was their new home. After 3 years' residency, they could apply for Canadian nationality, and children born in Canada were automatically entitled to citizenship. However, not all Ukrainians actually took up the offer of citizenship, and this would prove a tremendous downfall for them. Immediately war was declared, the Dominion of Canada threw its wholehearted support behind the mother country. As in many belligerent countries, initial distrust of citizens originating from Canada's so-called enemies, be these real or perceived, rapidly hardened into visceral hatred. All were assumed to be potential spies and saboteurs, whose nefarious activities needed controlling. On the 24th of August 1914, the Canadian War Measures Act allowed the authorities to arrest, detain, censor, exclude, deport, control, and capture all persons and property considered as potential threats to Canada. The 150,000 non-naturalized residents whose birth country lay within the Central Powers, which in Ukrainians' case was Austro-Hungary, territories had overnight become enemies. On the 28th of October 1914, the registration and even the internment of enemy nationalists was authorised. Within a matter of weeks, internment camps began to spring up. Anyone who was thought to be an enemy sympathiser could be arrested and interned without trial. This fate befell a significant number of German nationals, including their children, and indeed included, at least in one case, a British woman whose pre-war marriage had led to her losing her British and unwillingly gaining German nationality. Whilst I haven't time to tell you these children's stories, I would like to tell you about another group, the Canadian national children born in Canada to Ukrainian parents. Aware that a potentially explosive situation might be building up in Canada, on the 8th of February 1915, London sent the Canadian government a list of races considered to be hostile to Austro-Hungarian rule and thus underlined friendly to Canada. This list included those classed as Ukrainian. Ignoring these instructions, on the 19th of April 1915, the first group of 20 married couples and children, 92 people in whole, predominantly Ukrainian Catholics, were forcibly entrained in Montreal. Their destination was the distant Spirit Lake in Quebec. The small amount of money that through hard work they had accumulated since arriving in Canada, not to mention their homes, were confiscated, never to be returned. They were the vanguard of the several thousand Ukrainians who would languish at this notorious camp with tar paper shacks for families. Single men were confined under military orders in wooden barracks. The perimeter of the camp was surrounded by a high wire fence with large lamps at each corner, and the gates were locked at night to prevent escapes. Ironically, a number of internees, including children, remained until 1920, as post-war, these Ukrainians who during the war had been considered Austro-Hungarian were now deemed Russian and consequently a Bolshevik threat. When the American consul, one Ulrich Wilrich, who was overseeing Ukrainian affairs in Canada, visited Spirit Lake in November 1916, he commented on deplorable conditions, with prisoners, including children, huddled together like a herd of sheep in winter, cold and shivering from exposure. On the 13th of January 2008, the 93rd anniversary of the opening of Spirit Lake Camp, the last known survivor of any of the internment camps, 93-year-old Mary Bayark, died. As testimony to the dark, shameful shadow internment that had been cast over hundreds of families, it had taken Mary many decades to confess to her son that she had seen the light of day in a concentration camp in a tar paper shack in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by barbed wire, soldiers, rifles, and bayonets. Another victim, Mary Manco, was born in Montreal in 1909. The family's nightmare started in early 1915 when her parents, Andre and Catherine, their children, 6-year-old Mary, John, Annie, and baby Nellie, all Canadian citizens, arrived at Spirit Lake. 2-year-old Nellie died on the 22nd of May 1915. 79 years after her sister's death, Mary attempted to find her grave. I would like to go back and visit Nellie's grave one last time, but I'm told it's no longer there. Her body was moved. Why or when or how, I don't know. No one seems to know where she rests. Knowing where one's dead are buried and being able to visit them is a theme that runs powerfully through the story of the aftermath of the First World War. These families were at least kept together in life. Others were simply broken up, including the family of one H. Dumitrik. When he was transported to Spirit Lake over 2,500 kilometers away, he was amongst the many fathers who just disappeared when coming home from work one evening, leaving children fatherless until the end of the war, often waiting months to find out what had happened to him. Consul Wilrich described meeting Dmytryk, who handed him a pathetic letter written by his 9-year-old daughter, Katya, now lodged in a shack as their home had been confiscated. With tight censorship of both outgoing and incoming letters, it is amazing that hers ever reached him. She wrote, "My dearest father, we haven't nothing to eat, and they do not want to give us wood. My mother has to go 4 times to town to get something to eat. This shack is no good. My mother is going downtown every day, and I have to go with her, and I don't go to school. We, your small children, kiss your hands, my dearest father. Goodbye, my dear father. Come home right away. We cry for you every night." The Quebecois novelist J. Dumont, Le Pays du Domaine, epitomizes the internment program, its sinister shadows, echoing cries of women, and its overwhelming sense of melancholy, serving as a reminder of all the restless souls, including children, who were interned at kept at gunpoint during this black period of Canada's history. However, in attempts to come to terms with the past, the Ukrainian-Canadian Restitution Act received royal assent on the 28th of November 2005, thereby acknowledging that this unlawful internment of innocent men, women, and above all children had indeed happened. As we historians are so keen to point out, and yet still shake our heads in despair at how rarely this happens, it is only by acknowledging and addressing the past that we can hope to learn from and avoid similar mistakes in the future. Mary Manco's simple words of warning are powerful. She wrote, "Because no one bothered to remember or learn about the wrong that was done to us, it was done to others again and yet again. Maybe there is an even greater wrong in that." A young French boy, Désiré Bianco, saw the light of day near Marseille on the 4th of April 1902. Little is known about his early childhood, other than that he had a wayward streak, which his impoverished parents struggled to control. On the 6th of August 1914, to Désiré and his classmates' excitement, in full uniform and with flowers in their rifles, the 6 hussars marched past their classroom to Marseille Saint-Charles station. 12-year-old Désiré now had one obsession: to accompany the hussars to the front. In January 1915, Désiré made the first of 3 attempts to fulfill his dream. On the first 2 occasions, although he got close, he was rapidly returned with a flea in his ear to parental control, or lack of it. Still determined to, in his words, see the war, or at least more of it than he had already seen, having twice got close to the fighting around Alsace, the obstinate lad now tried his luck on a troop ship departing from Toulon. With his 13th birthday just behind him, on the 2nd of May 1915, young Désiré hid aboard La France, which was carrying men of the 58th Infantry Company to Cape Helles and the killing fields of the Dardanelles. One can only imagine his glee when the ship reached the open sea. A few hours later, the young stowaway was discovered. But as the ship certainly could not be turned round to offload one young fugitive, there was nothing for it, as far as the regiment was concerned, but to keep him with them, ideally clear out of harm's way. To Désiré's delight, he was kitted out with a rifle and a sailor's uniform. Arguably, it was a sailor's because with boy sailors aboard, something could be found to fit him, and he was designated regimental mascot. On the 6th of May, 1915, the regiment disembarked at Sed El Bahir in Gallipoli. Just as some of his near contemporary midshipmen serving with the Royal Navy are reported to have done, Désiré grinned in excitement as shells burst around him. Having taken up their position in the trenches and with barely the time to draw breath, on the 8th of May, the men of the 51st Regiment were ordered to attack and, irrespective of losses, take a small fort perched on Hill 300 to the east of Krithia. Désiré was ordered to remain in the battalion's trench, Perhaps by way of consolation, and astutely realizing that the youngster needed something more military to do than twiddle his thumbs, or, as the French put it, stir the soup, a Lieutenant Asquier instructed Désiré to keep his sword safe in the trench. At precisely 1300 hours, the men leapt out of the trench. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Asquier glimpsed a small figure brandishing his sword and shouting, "Forwards with bayonets, men!" Désiré's fate was now beyond anyone's control. Sometime before 1500 hours, when the first line of the battalion reached the Turkish trenches, little Désiré was seen to totter and fall. Like the battalion commander, Lieutenant Asquier, 16 other officers, 54 NCOs, and 842 men, including Mascotte Bianco, had survived barely 48 hours after disembarking from La France. His body, like those of so many others, was never found. By the 10th of December 1915, the 58th Regiment had been bled white. Back in France, with the disastrous campaign behind them, and further bloodbaths still to come, men of what was left of the company clamoured for recognition for their gallant, if thoroughly stubborn, little companion. On the 30th of August 1916, he was, with General Joffre's approval, cited in General Orders 54 of the day for the Armée de l'Orient. This special citation to the young Mascotte who died with the sword his officer had entrusted to him in his hand heads the lists of honours and awards conferred on the officers and men of this regiment for their gallant actions in the Dardanelles. Largely forgotten during the war years, in time, Désiré's enthusiasm and courage came to be constructed as more important than his obstinacy. On the 28th of August 1920, it was recognised that, killed by the enemy, he had died for France, which somewhat ironically entitled his parents to a pension. On the 17th of May 1936, 21 years and 9 days after his death, watched by his parents, the kid from Marseille was posthumously decorated with the Military Medal and the Croix de Guerre, and a monument to him was unveiled in front of Toulon's Grignon barracks. Only the churlish would suggest that the solemn-faced sculpture bears little resemblance to the mischievous, obstinate lad, whose story, as the local newspaper Var Matin pointed out on the 11th of November 2013, owes much to the futile, to the comic, to the tragic. Another teenage fighter who has aroused little interest amongst Anglophone historians is Sofia Lipovich, who was born in Poland. In August 1914, an independent Poland as we know it today did not exist, partitioned instead in the late 18th century between Austro-Hungary, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Russian Empire. Like so many of her contemporaries, Sofia had listened to tales of long-dead Polish freedom fighters, and in particular, female revolutionaries. It became my indomitable desire to follow in the footsteps of these great women and show the boys that it is not their exclusive privilege to fight for the freedom of their country. She would translate her defiant words into action. With war declared, and her father, who bitterly resented the dire necessity to fight under a foreign banner, drafted as a major in the Austrian army, the teenage tomboy made several abortive attempts to run away and join the motley Polish freedom fighters, which were springing up. Intercepted on each occasion, she was returned to her family to help care for her mother and 5 younger sisters. Between the winter of 1914 and 1916, Cossacks ransacked Sofia's home. Her village changed hands 3 times between the Russians and the Germans. At considerable personal risk, the young teenager began serving the Polish military organization as a courier, smuggling letters, money, and firearms. Finally, successfully running away and enlisting in a volunteer Polish defense force. Having joined the fighting ranks and claiming she knew how to shoot, the sergeant watched her carefully. Unimpressed, he spat and addressed her as girl citizen. Having been given a Polish national cap under which I hid my long braids folded so tightly round my head that it began to ache, I got rid of my skirt at the first opportune moment. Drilled and being taught how to handle a rifle, Sophia became worried when one of the officers looked at me wonderingly, and I, being afraid that he would realize was a girl, pushed my cap deep over my ears. However, she felt action was needed, so I went outside, where another soldier, without any ceremony, cut off my long hair, which then spread out, covered my uniform like an overcoat. By November 1918, Sophia was caught up in the Battle of Lemberg or Lvov, then part of eastern Galicia, now part of western Ukraine. Soon, in the thick of fighting, and taking to heart their officers' advice that despite being ill-equipped, the young freedom fighters should throw themselves into the fray, I forgot I was a woman. I knew only that I had to fight hard to avenge the Polish losses. Wounded, I did not feel the pain, though blood was pouring from my hands and forehead. The battle for Lvov was bloody and hard won. Children in their early teens, many of whom were killed, became known as the Lvov eaglets. The Polish artist Wojciech Kosak's painting of the eaglets is a visual testimony to the fighters' youth. The painting is sanitized. The children are clean and well clothed. More realistically, Sophia acknowledges, we were soiled with mud, blackened with smoke. I'm sure my mother would not have recognized me now. If for Sophia, the war had not yet ended, indeed the Battle of Lvov lasted until May 1919, and she saw it through to the bitter end. For many of the children you have met during the course of this chat, and many of others I have not had time to tell you about, November 1918 heralded a time of ambiguity. Despite the celebrations, at least for the Allies, many children had to accept that beloved family members would never return. Others accepted that the undoubted excitement of the war was over and life would return to a normality that many could not even remember, but soon proved boring. French children who had spent the war under the heel of a brutal occupier discovered, as young Yves Congar had presciently foretold in his diary, that the rest of France was disinterested in their fate, even accusing them of having collaborated and deeming them les Boches du Nord, or the Boche Germans of the North. The children who had been presented with jingoistic storybooks, board games and uniforms. The diarists who, like Yves Congar and Germaine Paruit, who had seen at first hand man's inhumanity to man. Those who had experienced the war inside internment camps, and those who had run away to war would, if they had looked back, have barely recognized their pre-war selves. One who would certainly not have done so, and who had arguably made the greatest emotional journey, is Piete Kuhr, who had so willingly sacrificed her tin soldiers for Germany's war effort in 1914. In late 1918, clutching a homemade wreath, near skeletal from lack of food, wearing shoes made of cardboard, shivering in old thin coats, 16-year-old Piete, accompanied by her ever-faithful friend Gretel, trudged through deep snow to the cemetery adjoining the prisoner of war camp they had so frequently visited. Here, the two adolescent girls paid homage to all who had suffered in the war. We placed our green fir wreath on an unknown Frenchman's grave, with him representing all whom the war had destroyed. Piete assured him, and by extension, all who had lost their lives, irrespective of the flag under which they fought. My thoughts are with you, and my tears every day. Piete escaped, as I said, Nazi Germany in 1936. She moved to America. She became a professional dancer, and her greatest dance was, in fact, her pacifist dance inspired by the French soldier's helmet that her German uncle had given her. She was finally commemorated in her native Schnarrnmühl on the 25th of April 2018 as a great woman of the 20th century. a fitting memorial to a young child who recognized that man's inhumanity to man covered all mankind and was not restricted to those whom we call the enemy. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, if you could stop your sharing, please.
There we are.
Right, thank you. We've got one question from Tony, I think. Do you want to ask the question, Tony?
Yes, please. Let me just get on. Right, yes, please. That was absolutely fascinating and moving talk. It crossed my mind when you were talking about the decimation of the Friends battalions in this country, which had a major impact on very condensed areas of industrial cities. And I wondered what the impact on children would have been there and how it was handled, if it was handled at all.
I think to the extent of how it was handled, children's grief, from what I have managed to sort of establish from my reading, children's grief was almost ignored, or it was felt that they shouldn't be allowed to really share their grief, that in many ways they should see life as going on as normal. I mean, I found one sort of interesting series of letters. It wasn't from a child in the Friends battalion, but it was a young boy whose father was killed when he was 13, and the aunt, so the father's sister, writes to the child's mother, "Oh, it's good that this boy Harry is getting over it so well, but I suppose it's too young to affect him." Well, I would have thought at 13 he was certainly not too young for it to have affected him. But there was definitely, my feeling is that children were basically not really encouraged to grieve. And I think that what has also become noticeable in reading that I've done and research that I've done is that sometimes children who lost a father would in old age finally managed to visit the grave in one of the Commonwealth War Grave cemeteries, and years of grief would pour out of them. And they write very movingly about weeping and weeping. Now, these were people who could not remember a father, who had buttoned up, who had been encouraged not to talk about him. Suddenly, the emotion becomes so overwhelming that they can't control it. And that comes across quite a lot in interviews that people did in old age, that because they were never really able to talk about their father, they suddenly made this connection through the headstone of this figure who had completely disappeared from their lives. I've also read about the odd child who lost 3 or 4 kin in the war and were almost punished at school for crying. There's one very moving story of a child who, after the armistice, all the children were supposed to go out and wave flags and sing "God Save the King," and because she had lost brothers and uncles, she absolutely refused to wave a flag or sing "God Save the King," and she was actually caned for this. So there was a feeling that children should almost let's teach them not to think about it, and then it'll go away and it won't matter. There were also, I mean, in Friends battalion situations, there were whole villages where almost all the children were growing up without a father. And there was the one that's just sprung to mind, one child I've read about, who actually found it almost embarrassing that her father had survived.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, you know, you suddenly become the odd one out because you've got a father, unlike this sort of opposite situation, being the odd one out whose father is dead. So sorry, that was a long answer to a question, but I think there's some quite interesting points to bring up.
Thank you, that was tremendous. Thank you.
John Edgar, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I just wonder how widespread the use of children was across the various different armies in the First World War. My grandfather was born in 1902 and served in the Royal Flying Corps. As a family, I think it's fair to say we're vertically challenged. So he couldn't have looked very old. And he definitely obviously joined up before the 1st of April, 1918, when the RFC transmogrified into the Royal Air Force. So he must have been quite young. And I just wondered how many actually of those youngsters slipped through the recruiting process.
A number certainly did slip through. There's very much the sort of the idea of once they'd slipped through, that was it. There were, if they were found, there were attempts made to return them. There was actually even a camp in Étape that was set up to keep them, the youngsters, the sort of 16 and 17-year-olds, to actually keep them out of harm's way and return them. Some certainly did get as far as the front, including my sort of slightly similar story to you. My husband's grandfather served in Gallipoli, age 16, but he was a big strapping lad, so it was quite normal, I suppose, that he'd slip through the net. And of course, birth certificates were not universal at that stage. So the authorities did, up to a point, try to return them, much more so than popular history believes. But a number of them, once they'd done it once, they did it again.
I mean, was it more widespread in, say, the Russian army? Or...
It was widespread in certainly across the Russian army. It was very widespread. I've got a fascinating story of a Cossack girl who was 13 when the war broke out, and she headed off with the Cossacks and survived, and actually then ended up being imprisoned by the Bolsheviks and finally making it to America. So yes, it happened across all armies. Certainly with the Polish, the young eaglets were very, very common. And I think the further sort of east you go, the blinder the eye that was turned to it.
Yeah.
And there was one American boy. He was 12, and he was a big boy for 12, and he got to France and served right across in France, and spent his 14th birthday severely wounded in a hospital. So these kids were slipping through the net, Australians as well, right across. I suppose the answer is a rebellious teenager. Once they're really determined to do something, they will give it their best shot.
Jenny, do you have a question?
That's interesting what you said about the rebellious teenager. My grandmother told me about her youngest brother who was given white feathers by local girls, although he was underage. So he signed up, and he was the one brother who didn't come back.
Oh,
so there was a lot of pressure going on, those young men, from the girls and their white feathers at the time.
She's a member of French Jeu.
I'm intrigued to know how you found out this information about these children from different countries, different parts of Europe and Canada.
Yes. I suppose. Well, how did I find out? It's always, I would say, one trail leads to another. The Canadian one, I think, was. Gosh, do you know, I can't remember how I found the Canadian one. I had a lot of trouble getting the information. And then I finally made contact with a Ukrainian association in Canada, who put me in touch with their archivist, and I got the information from that. And there've been a couple of pamphlets published about it. Because I speak French and German, that makes it.
Yeah, but the Italians were in Australia.
Easier to sort of do the research, sort of using various countries and archives, and I dig things out from all sorts of places, and then once I get onto the trail, then I just follow where it leads me, and sometimes it's to a dead end, and other times it's not. I got a lot of started on the French children through an exhibition in Evian in France that I just happened to visit, and I always pick up leaflets at those sorts of exhibitions, find out who the archivist has been, and then make contact and say any pointers. So it's a bit of a sort of, sometimes it's a wild goose chase and sometimes it's a productive one, but it's all great fun.
Right, thank you.
Are there any more questions, please? There's
There's anything in the chat.
There's nothing more in the chat.
No, I'm afraid I can't do that, but
Oh.
if nobody else has a question, may I ask one? Because,
Rowena.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
To continue with the story of Canada, I very often listen to Russia Today program, and in a program called Crosstalk, they very frequently refer to a Canadian lobby in Canada, or a Ukrainian lobby in Canada, which they feel has influenced both Canadian and United States policy in Ukraine, and feel that this is unfortunate. But certainly they think that it has also been replenished by refugees immediately after the Second World War, and then after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And it has very strong political feelings, obviously.
So, and have you sort of come across this mention of the Ukrainian children in the First World War in that?
No, it's not. It is not particularly about children, which is why I kept the question back until no one else wanted to ask anything. Right. But it's about a very strong Canadian community in Canada, which has its own lobby, and which the particular people in this program feel influenced Western policy in the Ukraine, about which actually we know very little. I mean, one knows little about what actually goes on inside Ukraine, as distinct from the fact that the Russians are massing their forces on the border. But I just wondered if you knew anything more about that. And
nothing at all, to be honest, because my focus had very much been this particular area of research, I mean, in which there are certainly the association that is looking for some sort of form of justice recognition. I think of what happened is strong, and that sort of obviously was a sort of focus of what I was finding out about, and I think that they feel that a wrong was done historically, and there's a feeling that this led very much to the internment of the Japanese in Canada in the Second War, which was brutal, and there was a feeling that if what had been done to the children, the Ukrainian children particularly in the First War, had been recognized, perhaps the Japanese children of the Second War may have had a better fate than actually befell them. But no, that's literally all I know about the Ukrainian Canadian Association.
Thank you very much for the talk. I found it absolutely riveting.
Good.
Yeah. Are there any other questions, please?
Shirley,
unmute yourself, Shirley. Unmute yourself.
Yeah. Just a comment that the loss of the breadwinner in families was a devastating thing economically for families.
Yes. Yep. And certainly you hear of children who are desperately trying to do some work to supplement the pitiful pensions. And I always digress whenever anyone says anything about the First World War. I always find something else that I can digress on. But I don't know if you know that the British government actually intentionally kept pensions, widow and family allowance pensions, as low as possible, out of fear that the mother, if she got a decent pension, wouldn't go out to work. So the idea was that if you gave the absolute minimum, it would ensure that the mother went out to work. Well, that was one thing during the war, but then at the end of the war, when women were encouraged to leave their jobs, it still left families even further impoverished because the pension was so low and the work had dried up. But there was definitely the allowances were only raised once during the war, despite the massive rise in the cost of living.
It was taxed.
And yeah, exactly.
Till she got quite old, and then it wasn't taxed. Well,
yeah,
she didn't really need the money. I mean, she took it. Obviously, didn't really need the money then, but.
It's no, huge injustice was done to families on that one.
Has anyone else got any questions or comments, please?
7,000 people were
So someone's saying something. You hear someone talking.
World War One.
Okay, no, I think that's
20% of all Italians living in Australia were interned. At the peak of the war, Australia held more than 12.
right. Ian, as I said, if no one else has another question, if Ian would like to sum up on that.
Thank you, Andy. It is my honor to propose a vote of thanks to Dr. Newman. What an astonishing talk. This is so much what Essex branch, what HA likes to do, bring researchers before us and share their findings. And what findings? How wide-ranging, from Newfoundland to Siberia, and such poignancy. That young girl from Charleroi, was it?
Yep, that's right, Charleroi.
Yvonne, oh, such poignancy. Your talk was so, and the imagery. This is all exciting, not exciting, it's fresh and vivid. Thank you very, very much indeed. And can I suggest to the rest of you that we make our usual noisy applause, please?
Thank you very much, Vivien. Very interesting.
Thank you for asking me. I always love talking about aspects of research, because the whole point of research is to go out and share it with others, isn't it? So that they can enjoy it as well. So thank you very much
And
indeed.
we have.
Fascinating.
Thank you.
One final bit of business to remind you all of our next meeting, which is on the 25th September. It'll be on this format, Zoom again. Who knows when we'll get to do possibly both formats, real and on Zoom. But it will be about Pearl Harbor. We're trying a departure. We're having our AGM, of course, but after that, we're going to discuss the advanced knowledge conspiracy theory about Pearl Harbor, and we'll have a protagonist and another. Who can tell me what the opposite of protagonist is?
Antagonist.
Thank you very much indeed. And you, the Zoom audience, will be asked to decide whose case was won on the day. So 25th September, same time, same place in your front rooms or wherever. Thank you for coming this afternoon. Don't feel you have to rush away. Some of us are staying behind. If some of you wish to ask us questions, those of us who are on the committee, please feel free. But that's the official business concluded. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Use it.
Thank you very much.